Hey girl, Marissa here. You are listening to the Codependent Dummy podcast. As a young woman, you have been raised, reinforced, and rewarded for putting the needs of others above your own. Now, in your 20s, you're finding yourself exhausted, exasperated, and enveloped in shit relationships, especially the one you have with yourself. Codependency is a way of being where we put the feelings, wants, and needs of others above our own in an unconscious attempt to meet our own feelings, wants, and needs. Sorry to break it to you, sis, but that is not sustainable. This podcast is to help you undo all that so you can stop playing small and start taking up space. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Codependent podcast. Today, I am here with Rachel Wilson. Rachel is a psychotherapist, yoga therapist, and social justice activist committed to supporting people impacted by personal, systemic, and vicarious trauma to re-embody and reconnect. She focuses her work in private practice on helping people who put their energy into supporting others and the community to care for themselves holistically. Rachel, thank you for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yes. All right, so we'll start with the typical two. First question, how do you conceptualize codependency?
I really think about codependency in terms of boundaries and lack of boundaries, and really focusing on other people instead of focusing on ourselves. So I often think like the alternative to that, the interdependence, and like the antidote to codependency is about vulnerability and accountability. So often in codependent relationships, people are focused on the other person, often losing what's happening within themselves. And I think there's often a lot of projection that happens, and then nothing can get solved because we're not owning or taking responsibility for what's really ours to heal or share or get our needs met in a particular way.
That was so profound. I want to unpack that more. So, okay. Initially, so you think of codependency in terms of boundaries and the lack of boundaries. Say more about that thought.
Sure. And I think I'll say, because I often work with really highly sensitive people and empaths. So in particular, I think emotional boundaries are really a big piece of codependency, meaning people are taking responsibility for the other person's emotions and feeling like it's their responsibility to make them feel okay, or that everything in the relationship is okay. And with empaths or highly sensitive people, it can get really confusing because you viscerally experience other people's emotions as if they're your own.
Right.
So it can be really unclear of like what's actually yours and what's not yours. And so I think the boundaries piece is really important in being able to first, like the vulnerability piece of being able to look at what you're feeling, what you're experiencing as a way to better understand like how to set boundaries, how to ask for what you need.
Is there a dog there?
There is a dog.
What's your dog's name?
My dog's name is Pepper.
Hi, Pepper. Okay, everyone say hi to Pepper. We'll welcome him, her, they?
Her.
Okay. All right, and then that was the first part of your definition, right? The lack of boundaries. Focusing on others. Any thoughts on that? Focusing on others?
I think it's often just comes from a place of adaptivity, often, like as someone who's worked a lot with people who experience childhood trauma. That is something that's actually a really adaptive response when you're younger, and that you have to learn how to care for others in order to survive, It's just as you grow up, it becomes less adaptive in creating healthy relationships.
Right. And the solution or healing recovery comes as a consequence of vulnerability and accountability. Your thoughts on that?
I think the vulnerability piece is really important because often I think the projection happens a lot in codependent relationships, and we blame other people for our own experience in codependent relationships. And I think that often comes with like a fear of being fully seen, or a fear that our needs aren't going to be met, or that they're not important. So then that vulnerability piece of being able to just even acknowledge that we have needs, I think is like the first step for a lot of people,
Right.
to be able to like just give yourself that grace that you can't do everything on your own.
Right.
And being able to share that with someone else gives them the opportunity to match that vulnerability. And the accountability piece is really of when I've done something wrong, being able to say, like, I fucked up and I'm sorry, and try to do things differently instead of blaming the other person for that. Because then you get stuck. There's nothing you can do within that dynamic if it's constantly looking outside yourself to get your problems fixed.
Right. And I'll add to that this, right, the healing, we could say recipe in your experiences, acknowledge we have needs first. 2, the vulnerability piece is sharing those needs. 3, accountability, if and when we do fuck up, right? Not blaming someone. Well, I did this because you, or we'll remember when you ... Now I'm getting even. Part of the healing in my codependency, and I sense with a lot of listeners, is also holding other people accountable, which that's different than blaming, right? I think with blame comes an imbalance, right? An indebtedness, and holding someone accountable. There is more of a, I don't know, like equal share, or I don't know, you're nodding your head. What are your thoughts?
Well, I just think codependency always goes both ways, right? That we assume that we're responsible for other people's emotions and they're responsible for ours.
Right.
So I think you're like, I really agree with that. My own experience, a big piece of it was like not letting other people treat me in a particular way, right? Because that leads to resentment, and that leads to the blaming. And then there's a big cycle that happens in that way.
Right. So holding them accountable would mean to potentially, worst case scenario, I think a lot of what I feared was ending a relationship. Yeah, it's like, okay, I have these needs, I'm sharing these needs. If you're not able to work with me here, collaborate where we're both getting our needs met, this might be over. And it can't be over because I'm codependent, Rachel. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, and I think that's the reality too, of like, especially if you grew up in a household where if you express your needs, there was emotional withdrawal or there was these other consequences. I think that's such a visceral experience. Like it's fight or flight kicking in those moments. It's like survival happens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you started to hint at, so we'll move on to question 2. Do you have a codependent experience from your own life to share?
Yeah, I would say I grew up in a very codependent household. My parents have a very codependent relationship, and I think I grew up often as a highly sensitive person, being very aware of all of the emotions that were in the house but never really dealt with or talked about. So I often took the role of like emotional caretaker in the family and making sure I shoved my own needs down for a very long time. Like I always did really good in school. I got in trouble in many other ways, but was very good at hiding it. Kind of, I think I had learned to very adaptively just like take care of myself, be independent. But then that got really complicated as I got older. And that isn't, then it's really hard to actually have true connection with other people when I can't be vulnerable and allow people to see like all of me, the messy parts too.
Right. Does a specific experience or memory with your parents or emotionally caretaking or the consequences later in life come to mind?
I think it's complicated. I'm not currently talking to my parents right now at this moment in time. And I think part of that is the reality that when I did speak up and ask for my needs, like that couldn't be met with respect. So I think that's like something that is just like an honest reality of learning boundaries is some people can't respect them or meet you where you need them to be.
Wow. Right. So that recipe I just suggested, I'm becoming aware of my needs. I'm going to be vulnerable and share my needs. I'm going to hold myself accountable to meeting them and you accountable to collaborating with me. And there's risk there that holding you accountable might mean ending, pausing, decreasing my investment in a relationship. And you're like, that is me right now with my mom and dad. Wow. Yeah. And I am curious, I don't think thus far on the podcast, I've specifically had someone, I think we've mentioned HSP, highly sensitive people. And also, can you give us the 101 definition just for our understanding?
Yeah, of course. I mean, there's like different definitions from different people, but essentially there's like HSP and empath, and they often get interchanged and used differently. HSP, highly sensitive person, is a more psychological concept, I would say, which means that you're just really highly sensitive to stimulus. So you're able to pick up subtle cues, and it shows up in many different ways. So you can be like, have a hard time being in big crowds. That can be overwhelming. And it's really at like a visceral body level. So if you have like a lot of anxiety, but there's not really a clear cause, there's not thoughts, there's not something happening, it can be a sign of being highly sensitive, especially when you're in like large groups of people or around certain people. And you can just get overstimulated easier. So like if you have big to-do lists or you have a really busy day, that can just like really overwhelm the nervous system, essentially. Empath, which I think there's some overlap, less scientific concept, is more like really viscerally feeling other people's emotions. And I think there's not like a clear case of it being tied to trauma, but I just know so many of my clients who are HSP also had childhood trauma. So I think in some ways it can be like an adaptive response as well.
Yeah. I haven't written it yet, but I have a note on my phone with podcast solo cast ideas. And one of them, I've probably been sitting on this for over a year, is, am I an HSP? It's just, I don't know, because I haven't explored it enough, but it's such I sense very related to yeah, if not, there's like a Venn diagram somewhere where it's like codependency and HSP, and then there is a significant overlap. Yeah.
And I would say they look there's the overlap, but they're experienced differently, I think. So I
Right.
have clients who definitely fit in just the codependence category, where I think the motive, like maybe the behaviors look the same, but the motivation might be a little different. So in codependency, it's often like fear is motivating it, like a fear of being abandoned.
Right.
And that might be part of HSPs, but I think oftentimes it's really like the discomfort that comes for an HSP in setting boundaries. So like viscerally experiencing someone's anger or upset when you set boundaries can be a piece of that, or just like being in close relationship with someone, you experience their emotions more.
Mm.
So then there's ways that you're trying to take care of them because it's really impacting you on a very
Right.
visceral level.
Right. Yeah, I get that. One is, yeah, fear, and the other one is just regulation. Yeah, really trying to regulate. Okay, you need to get regulated so I can get regulated. This is so uncomfortable. And the other is, you need to be okay, so I'm okay, so we're okay. Yeah, fear. Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. And turning more towards your specialties, right? Yoga therapy, somatic therapy. Mm, we'll start. Yeah. What is yoga therapy?
And so yoga therapy is not like Lululemon pants going to a studio. I always start there. Yoga
Mm-hmm.
therapy is actually a way of creating really individualized practices that bring mind, body, spirit into whatever work that we're doing. So there's a philosophy that underlies yoga that it often informs my work, that is kind of bringing in we are more than just our body or our mind, and connecting to deeper parts of ourselves.
Well,
And then there's the piece around like emotional regulation is a large part of it. So using our body, using our breath to be able to regulate ourselves, and ultimately regulating our energy and being aware of how things are impacting us, how we're moving through our day, and then being able to like bring yourself back into balance.
mm. And I'm curious. I'm in therapy. I go to yoga. What's unique about yoga therapy with a licensed therapist, like psychotherapist? Yeah.
Yeah, I would say it's really more integrated, meaning it's like bringing the body, bringing that awareness into talk therapy. So it's really like not just something we do on a mat, but how are we bringing that into our everyday lives, into the therapy room? But also, I create a lot of practices for my clients, individualized practices. So if we're working, if people want to do like a daily practice, we create something that's going to really layer in mind, body, spirit into that practice. So bringing like goals from therapy into that practice.
Well,
And then it can be also just like simple things to do during the day. So,
right.
like simple practices that we can use throughout the day to bring us back into balance.
Mm.
I work with a lot of like teachers and therapists and social workers. So, a lot of it is kind of like burnout, compassion, fatigue, prevention things we do
Right.
as well.
And do you sometimes either virtually or in person do poses in session? And what's that like?
Yeah, I would say that's more often if we're creating a practice they're going to be doing out of session, we will do a little practice so they can take that and work on their own with a practice. Oftentimes, more what I'm bringing in into session is more body awareness. So the somatic piece of it, or breath practices, or ways we're really like learning to connect to our somatic experience of whatever we're talking about. Because I find often, and especially with my clients who like tend to focus on other people all the time, when we can drop into our body, then we get to those deeper feelings and
Right.
see what's really happening. Because if we're just focusing on everyone all the time, it's often an avoidance of what we're feeling inside.
Right. So I'm hearing in your work, right, really individualizing poses, series of poses, breath work, and that's right. The hope is that therapy isn't just an hour a week, but it could be. It really could be. And so I would say, yeah, unlike other forms of therapy, I'm hearing yoga therapy is one real way where there's this tangible, again, somatic practice where it's assigned, right? You could or could not do it. But yeah, targeting compassion fatigue, burnout, codependency, your patients integrate that through their week. There's some of that within the session. And then they can also share with you like, oh, like during warrior pose or during this, I don't know, laughing baby pose, I was crying. And then you process that experience.
Yeah, I would say less so like what comes up in the poses and more so thinking of yoga as a practice we're doing constantly. So, yoga as really this practice of self-realization, self-awareness. So, how am I taking what I'm doing on the mat, what we do in a yoga class, of being aware what's happening in my body and my breath, and kind of how things are impacting me in a practice? How do we do that in every moment of our day?
Well, damn, that's amazing. And I am curious, how have you used it to support those clients overcoming codependency?
Yeah, and I think a big piece of it is that like how to prioritize taking care of yourself and your needs, and doing a practice for yourself regularly is such an important piece of like just starting that process, right? Because I think when we decide that we want to start healing, when we want to start taking care of ourselves, that's like a shift in itself towards being able to like shift in our relationships. Even just creating the time to do that for ourselves by saying no to other people's needs, I
Right,
think can have like a profound impact.
right. Other thoughts on how yoga therapy is used to support overcoming codependency, right? Prioritizing the practice, which in and of itself helps shift your relationship with yourself and others.
Yeah, and I think going back to the vulnerability piece is like in order for us to share our needs, we have to be aware of what's happening
Right.
internally. So I think a lot of the work I do with people is really using the somatic piece and body awareness to really tap into our emotions, because I think there's so much emotional suppression that happens in codependency. But that's a really important piece, because oftentimes, and this is like personally, I've done this, I know, around boundaries, and I've seen clients do it where you're like setting boundaries because you think that's what you should be doing,
Right.
but it's not actually aligned with what you're feeling inside. So it doesn't really stick. So I think the like body awareness piece is actually really important in being able to identify what we're feeling. I think anger and resentment are really important to look at in codependency, and often really hard for people to look at when they've had really unhealthy examples of anger. in their life
Mm-hmm.
because they give us really important information of like when our boundaries have been crossed, when something is like feels unjust, or when we've been silenced. And like when we suppress and push those down, then we're missing really important information about what we need, how to communicate that to someone else.
Right.
So I think like just really bringing in the awareness of emotions and within our body is a really important piece of the healing process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So becoming aware. Yeah. Huge piece. Yeah, I'm curious to hear more. I think I've struggled with this. I'm sure listeners have. I know my patients have. Instagram, TikTok, self-help books, right? It's all like create a boundary, say no, like cancel, like, just, yeah, like move on. And we're in our codependent recovery. I think there's just like this pendulum swing from being a boundaryless yes girl, will tolerate pretty much everything, to a quote unquote badass no girl, no tolerance, zero tolerance policy. And yeah, creating boundaries, not so much for our betterment, but I don't know, really, because we're trying to please what social media and the authors are telling us. So yeah, your thoughts on like how that might show up in the body. Thoughts?
I think the pendulum is just very real, right? And
Yeah.
anytime we try to make changes, when we're figuring something out that we've never done before, I think it's natural we kind of swing the other direction. And I think, does that boundary actually feel aligned, right? That's the body piece is, am I saying no because I really mean no? Does that really feel like good in my body to say that? Or I'm saying no because I think I should say no. It still doesn't come from this like internal awareness. And maybe awareness isn't the right piece, but almost like a barometer. And I think
Mm.
so much of the process I often do with my clients is how do we really know what is true for us instead of looking outside us for the answers?
Damn. How do we know what's really true for us? Continue.
But I think there's been so much, I mean, capital, like all these things kind of like tell us to look outside ourselves for the answers as women in particular. Like we've been taught to silence ourselves. Us having needs makes us needy, or it makes us, like attention seeking, and all of these messages, I think, that come from many different places that we learn not to trust ourselves. And I think a big piece of healing is building that trust with yourself again. And being able to differentiate, is this emotion or is this intuition and my really true understanding? And I think it takes a while to get there when there's a lot of emotions that haven't been processed. And so I think that's part of the pendulum swing when it's like feeling all the things that haven't really been felt
Right.
before and wanting to protect yourself and not wanting that to happen again. But it turns into like a giant door that keeps everything out.
Mm-hmm. You're reminding me a codependent relationship in my early 20s. It it was not going well for different reasons. And I remember I was with that ex-boyfriend. So we broke up, and very reactively, which happened a couple times. This wasn't, I don't think this was the first one either. So we broke up, and right, friends, family, what social media existed at the time, everyone was voting, fuck him, block him, never talk to him again. And I remember as you're speaking, logging onto my Verizon account, blocking him, and then unblocking him immediately again. Just I was at this little fork, this metaphorical fork, I guess literal too, but I kept blocking and unblocking him in that moment, and yeah, I think there were a lot of unprocessed feelings. It wasn't so much awareness on how do I really know this is true for me. It was everybody else, understandable vote, but yeah, I wasn't sure. Obviously I wasn't ready to do that, create that boundary. Mm-hmm.
Yes, I have been there too.
Mm-hmm.
And I also think we have a weird thing about boundaries where it has to be this like complete cut off.
Right.
And I do think social media is a big piece of that. I think like the longer I've been working with my boundaries and refining them is actually more about like, how can I be in relationship with people in a way that feels good to me, even if it's a little more peripheral
Right.
than having them be in the middle. I have one client, we were talking about just, oh, you can have relationships that aren't like completely deep and connected in that way. I think a big piece of in my own personal journey and what I've seen with my clients is how do we embrace having relationships that have all types of distance and
Mm-hmm.
boundaries, and that a relationship doesn't have to be like completely connected to be healthy.
Right. Like the solar system. You have your
Yeah,
Plutos and your Earths. If you're the sun, which you are, you're the sun.
definitely the
Um,
sun.
yeah, love that. How do we embrace all types of distance in relationships? And in your thoughts, Rachel, I mean, you're already starting to touch on this, but why? Why is it important to work somatically, to work with the body when we're dealing with codependency?
I think, yeah, I've touched on a lot of it, but I think so much of it is held in our bodies in this way that, like, oftentimes codependency is a suppression of our own emotions and needs. And I often see that looks like a disconnection from mind and body as well. This kind of living up in our minds, wanting to psychoanalyze and understand everyone else, and how that often is actually used as an avoidance to really go and sit with what we're experiencing in our bodies. On the other side of that, too, is I think being able to set boundaries, a big piece of it is learning how to regulate ourselves in the discomfort of
Mm,
that. So I think being able to have tools that really can give us space to sit with discomfort in our body, regulate our nervous system, is a super big piece of being able to hold boundaries and not just say them, but actually hold them and honor the boundaries you want to set for yourself.
mhm. How do you regulate in discomfort?
I think it's I think it's two things, right? One is part of the work is being able to know when you're in discomfort, know that that's coming up for you.
Right.
So that, I mean, personally, when my mind starts like just going and going and going, I'm like, what am I avoiding? I think that can
Mm,
even be just we notice these habitual patterns. So if our mind is just going on something or ruminating on something, something that I personally do, what I often have my clients do, is then use that as a signal to like tune into the body. So what's there in those moments?
Right.
And then to sit with discomfort takes a practice, right? Of being able to breathe. And that's, I think yoga is a beautiful practice for that, because a lot of the physical practice is learning to be in discomfort and breathe into it. And so being able to take that into everyday life and do that in the moment. And then I think a lot of it is just like using our breath, knowing what we need to do overall to be better regulated in our nervous system. So I always think of it as, what are we doing day to day or not doing? What are we saying no to? What are we creating space for in our life that gives us energy? What's taking energy away from us? And how do we just better regulate and balance how we are all the time? And then in the moment, having just kind of some go-to practices of, even if it's just deep breathing, something that you know you can do
Right.
in anticipation that it's going to be uncomfortable when you set boundaries for the first time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we regulate in the discomfort by knowing I am in discomfort and sitting with it, right? Breathing. Yoga does teach that, right? Pigeon pose, or I don't know, just weird, the more acrobatic stuff. Yeah, I'm like, can we please? My instructor, she's doing a headstand. I'm like, I'm not going to do a headstand. So I'm in this really awkward, like amateur pseudo headstand. It is uncomfortable. And so you sense like inviting awareness in that moment builds our muscle to do that outside of yoga.
Ideally, right?
Right. Yeah. And then tools like using our breath, right? Preparing before, being mindful like of a difficult conversation or anticipating discomfort. Other tools that come to mind?
There's so many tools. I think just simple like stretching, and there's all these ways that we can use our body to regulate our nervous system. So in terms of breath, our exhales turn on the relaxation part of our nervous system. So anytime we're lengthening our exhales for longer than our inhales, that's going to help us to calm down. So often I'll have people breathe into 3 or 4 and then double that. So 6 or 8. Simple breath practice you can do. Simple stretching just helps our nerves to communicate better. So simple stretching can help relieve any tension, shoulder rolls, stretching our neck, simple things like anything we're doing can just help us to calm down the body. In terms of body positioning, if you fold forward, it helps to calm down the body. So even just doing like a standing forward fold and taking a couple of breaths like that can help to calm the body. I often do tapping. So that is a practice that is really helpful for calming the body down, just tapping along the head, down across the face, across the chest, the collarbones. Shaking, like literally just shaking out the body.
Right.
Anything that we're releasing energy can be helpful.
Got it. All those, yeah, in your experience and those of your clients, helps regulate the discomfort. Yeah. Other insights for why it is important to work somatically when dealing with codependency.
I think it can just be important to also do that with a partner. So if you're partnered, being able to regulate with each other can be really helpful. So before we have this conversation, let's take a couple deep breaths, right? Or even just noticing body positioning. So we get a lot of information about how we're feeling, how open we are, if we're covering ourselves, hugging in, for opening ourselves up across our chest. All of that can actually be really important when we're trying to connect with someone else and be more vulnerable. To be able to like be aware of our body, what it's expressing, can be helpful in relationship with other people.
Yeah. So yeah, even our posture or seated position is important too. That also is related to working somatically when, it comes to being vulnerable, holding people accountable, becoming aware of ourselves, etc. Yeah. And we've touched on tools. What are other initial steps or suggestions you provide to your codependent clients when starting out with somatic or yoga therapy?
I think it's just important to acknowledge it takes a varying degree of time to reconnect to our body. So, especially if you've experienced trauma, dissociation is a really normal experience. So there's, again, it's adaptive, right? Our body decided like, this is too much. So I'm going to leave, right? Our mind decided there was too much in our body. So we leave.
Right.
And just to really normalize that process, that it takes a long time to reconnect to yourself and to your experience. And that it just takes practice. There's not a right way to do it. I think the most important thing is just like creating space for yourself to tune into yourself, even if it's just journaling to start. I've just seen it can take a really long time for people to be able to really tap into what's happening in their body. So that's just a normal part of the process. There's not doing it wrong. And I would say that more important than anything is just like the willingness to do it. So like being able to sit with what's coming up. So a lot of times when I'm working with people, it's like, okay, let's take a pause and we're going to sit and feel what's happening inside. And sometimes that needs to happen with me in that space because they don't feel comfortable doing that on their own, which is totally fine. I think that's part of the process of healing in relationship with people and building that space to co-regulate before you can do it on your own.
Right. This is a potentially biased question, but Rachel, do you sense healing from codependency is possible without somatic parts to integrate it into the healing process?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can get to healing in many different ways.
So you're like, this is just one road to Rome, but there's other roads.
Yeah, I mean, I think we all can approach things in very different ways and get to the same place.
True. Yeah. I don't know. I might say no. Somatic. I think, I don't know, but I feel like a theme from multiple guests as the show has gone on is this real emphasis on cultivating awareness. And yeah, maybe we can cultivate awareness different ways, but the most common and most available and most mentioned is through the body, the soma.
Yeah, and I would say oftentimes I think about it as it's our way to the unconscious,
Mm,
right? It's like, oh, there's that trigger or that emotion, and those are just like things pointing us to what we're holding under our conscious awareness.
right.
Right. So that's why I say, like, there's many ways to get there. It's like, how are you tapping into that unconscious stuff?
Mhm.
I think the soma is a really great way to get there, but there's also other ways to do it.
Right. Mhm. And going back to some initial steps you take, right? Tools, this experience that people get in touch with their bodies at varying lengths of time. That's relative. We mentioned dissociating as an adaptive strategy, safeguard, and that is less adaptive as time goes on. So I just, I had this thought, okay, so the goal is to be associated, right? Associated with my body. Are you associated with your body, and what does that look like throughout one's day, throughout your day?
I think that's a great question. I've done a lot of work. I was very dissociated for a lot of my
Mm.
life. So yoga has been, and this is why I love yoga therapy, is yoga's been one of my biggest healing tools. I think therapy
Oh,
is very helpful. I see a therapist, that's a very big part of it too. But yoga has done something for me that I don't think I would have been able to access deeper parts of myself without yoga.
well,
So I do think I've done a lot of work to be very aware of what I'm experiencing all the time. Not all the time. I'm not, it's not like this perfect, you don't meet this like a perfect attainment of it, but that requires a lot of distress tolerance of being able to
mm,
be like, I'm really sad right now, and, or I'm mad, or I'm this or that, and be able to stay with that
right.
and know how to be in relationship with it in a different way. So I think a lot of times it's just acknowledging we have feelings. That's part about of being human. And then how am I relating to that? So I'm not adding more frustration, more anger because I have an experience and then I'm not judging myself for it.
Mhm.
Um, so I think I've done yoga for 17 years. So I think it's a practice that really has helped me to reconnect and associate with my body again. But that does come with work of being able to be present with all the like good things and all the not so good things that come up in the
Mhm.
process.
That's amazing, Rachel. Just want to acknowledge that it takes a lot of work. And I know in my own experience, and I had a session with a patient this week, and she's like, I, yeah, I'm not doing anything to help myself, and I don't care, and I don't want to explain. And I was like, no need, no, yeah. It was like, don't ask any questions. And I'm like, like, no, you do not have to answer or be, I don't know, explain here. But yeah, I know in my own experience, um, yeah, I get that. I don't wanna sit with this feeling. I'd rather go like, Marissa, stop being so dramatic and judge that feeling away. So really sitting with and welcoming it.
It's hard.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of things I would rather do than feel the feeling.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But
And
I
yet,
also,
yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I also know that really didn't work for me long term when I was doing those things.
Right.
Right? Like in the moment, it made me feel better. But long term, it was harming myself, my health, and my relationships with people.
Right. The irony of the healing journey. The short term comfort, long term consequences, and then sitting in a feeling which feels like forever is temporary and just leads to feeling better overall.
Yeah. And I also think it's like okay to not be doing healing work all the time. Like, I think there can also be something that happens when it's like, I'm gonna get better. I'm gonna put all this work in myself that we forget to just enjoy life. And if you need a break, then just take a break. Sometimes we don't have the energy, and that's totally fine. Or it's not like
Mm-hmm.
like a perfection that we're working towards.
Right.
It's just like, how do we feel better overall?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So associated, the goal is to be associated. Mm-hmm. Final thoughts as we wrap up?
Mm. I think just the associated is sticking with me in some way. And then the word integration
Mm.
that almost goes along with that. So part
What
of the
does
goal is
integration mean? Yeah.
to associate with our body, but that also means like bringing all of these parts of ourself into the space to feel them and experience them. And then it doesn't feel so big overall when they're all in conflict with each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you have an example of that top of mind?
Um, One thing that's just coming to me is this idea of goodness and how there's like pieces of our identity that we feel often are in conflict with this idea of what it means to be good or to fit in some type of box or to fulfill a certain role. And then I think that needs to be looked at in some ways where there's like deeper beliefs about who we are and who we're supposed to be and how that gets played out in these like internal battles within ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Any other thoughts on that example? Goodness.
I know I'm trying to think if there's a specific example.
Like I know I'm punctual for different reasons. One of them being I'm good, right? I'm a good prompt respecting person meeting you and I will not disrespect you by being late. I'm good, right? Do you think I'm good? Please see me as good.
Yeah, I think that's a really good example. And I think there's ways of also the way we learned of like boundaries and what it means to be good seems like a big piece of codependency of it's good like and even kind of religious or spiritual reinforces that like it's good to put others first. It's good to like put your own needs aside. There's ways I think there's like messages, cultural messages we get about what makes us a good person that's associated with like silencing ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Right. So the work is to build awareness of that goodness within ourselves, and also the parts of us that we potentially have silenced, integrating those to maybe be a decent person who's good and also is meeting her needs.
Yeah, or just a person,
Just
right?
A person. Just a person.
Like being a person means we all have good and bad things about us. It's just the reality.
Yeah, I love it. No adjective. Yeah. Mm-hmm. All right. Well, Rachel, thank you so much for coming on. If people are curious to connect with you, where can they find you?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm pretty active on Instagram. My handle is Interconnected Healing. And then my website is interconnectedhealing.com. I have a twice monthly newsletter I send out. It's called the Collective Care Letter. So I put kind of like just some thoughts each time. I also add practices and community like members and colleagues I know who have offerings that are really supportive. So I put that in the newsletter if they want to join.
Awesome. All right. So I will put links to your Instagram and website in the show notes. And
Great.
Yeah, again, thank you. And thank you, dear listener, for being here. And we will see you next week. Hey, girl. It's Marissa again. I'm not like a regular podcaster. I'm a cool podcaster, right? Thank you for listening and staying till the end. You can find me on Instagram at Therapy with Marissa. Email me, marissa@codependummy.com. Check out codependummy.com for more information on the show. And baby girl, a subscribe, rating, and review would be much appreciated. Till next time, I want you to remember, if you are feeling unseen, I see you. If you are feeling unheard, I hear you. And if you think that you don't matter, know that you matter to me. I want you to go out there so you can stop playing small and start taking up space, you dummy. And now, the disclaimer. Girl, this is not therapy and I am not your therapist. This podcast is designed to provide accurate and authoritative information in regards to the subject matter covered. It is given with the understanding that neither the host, publisher, or guests are rendering any legal, clinical, or other professional service. If you want or need a professional, please